Section 3. Macroeconomics. As is true in physical sciences, the methods and approaches that are most effective in understanding economic phenomena depend on the type of question we're asking. For example, biologists studying the operation of particular molecules using models and types of data that are different from those used by scientists who wish to understand larger ecosystems, even though the same fundamental principles apply. In the same way, when economists wish to understand the performance of an entire economy, how much it produces, or what causes national unemployment rates to fluctuate, the models and data they use are different from those that they use when they want to understand what happens in specific markets, such as the market for petroleum. The branch of economics that studies the performance of national economies is called macroeconomics. This section of the resource guide provides an introduction to the major questions addressed in the macroeconomics and describes the most important approaches to these questions. Broadly speaking, macroeconomics is concerned with two questions. The first concerns the factor that determine the long-run growth in size of economies, the standard of living that they provide for their participants, and the price level. The second issue concerns the causes and consequences of short-term fluctuations in the level of economic activity, unemployment, and inflation. We will begin this part of the resource guide by presenting some evidence about these issues that help motivate our subsequent analysis, and by discussing the types of aggregate economic indicators that are used to describe the performance of the aggregate economy. This includes measures such as gross domestic product, GDP, the cost of living, and unemployment rate. These measures figure prominently in public discussion of the state of economy and economic policy. Knowing how these concepts are defined and interpreted is important for everyone and is essential to understanding the behavior of the economy. The remainder of this part of the resource guide will develop a theoretical framework for analyzing aggregate economic performance. We begin by describing factors that determine the size of the economy in the long run. We then will consider the role of the financial system and the use of money. Finally, we will turn to the cause of the short-run fluctuations in the economic activity. Macroeconomic issues. We have said that macroeconomics is concerned with the performance of national economies. To get a more concrete sense of why this is important and what it means, it will be helpful for us to look at a number of aspects of the U.S. economy. Economic growth and living standards. One of the most remarkable facts about the U.S. economy is its long-run history of growth. Figure 30 illustrates the growth of total output of the U.S. economy from 1900s to the present. The measure of output used in Figure 30 is the real gross domestic product, GDP. This is a measure of the total quantity of goods and services produced in an economy adjusted to remove the effect of inflation. We will discuss in more detail how output is measured shortly, but for now, let's focus on what Figure 30 shows. According to these data, since 1900s, the total real output of the U.S. economy has increased by a factor of nearly 40. There are some small ups and downs apparent in this chart, most notably the decline in output between 1929 and 1933, the Great Depression, and the expansion of output from 1941 to 1945, World War II. Viewed on this timescale, however, the impact of these events is dwarfed by the expansion of the size of the overall economy. At the level of the overall economy, what we can consume is limited by what we produce. One reason for raising level of production historically has been the growth in population. More people can produce more output. But output has grown much faster than population. Since 1900, the U.S. population has increased by a factor of more than 4. Combining this information with the data in Figure 30 implies the average output per person has increased by a factor of 9. Figure 31 illustrates the growth of output per person. Economists refer to this quantity as output GDP per capita. The term per capita is a Latin phrase literally meaning per head, which is commonly used to denote averages calculated for an entire population. While average output per capita provides an indication of what a typical person can consume, economists are also interested in changes in what the average person can produce. The economy's total output divided by the total number of workers employed is called average labor productivity. This is a measure of how much the typical worker can produce. The second, higher line in Figure 31 shows the history of average labor productivity since 1900. The average output per person in the U.S. economy in 2019 was over $65,000. To put this figure into perspective, Figure 32 compares the total output and output per person in the United States to a selection of other countries around the world. The range of variations in production per person is remarkably large. Despite having a population nearly 5 times as large as the United States, China's total production is only about 2/3 that of the United States, while its per capita output is only about 15% as large as the United States. These countries with the lowest level of production per person in this list are in South Asia and Africa, while India, for example, is starting to catch up to wealthier countries. Its output per capita is only 3.2% that of the United States. Even in the United States and other advanced economies, such as those in Japan and Western Europe, there are still many people living in poverty. But even the poorest citizens of these countries enjoy access to a bounty of material goods that far exceeds the consumption possibility of the typical resident of countries at the bottom of the list in Figure 32. Human happiness, of course, depends on more than just the material level of consumption that we're able to achieve. Living a long and healthy life, access to education, and clean environment are also important. But the reality is that the material resources created by higher levels of production makes possible longer life, broader access to education, better health care, and a cleaner environment. These relationships are illustrated in Figure 33, which shows the relationship between output per person and several other indicators of quality of life. Recessions and expansions. If you look closely at the line showing total output in Figure 30, you will see that the rate at which the U.S. economy output has grown is not steady. There are periods of rapid growth and periods of slower growth, or even decline. The decline in real output during the Great Depression is particularly striking, as is the sharp increase during the Second World War, 1941 to 45. We can also see in these data the recession that coincided with the 2008 financial crisis. The variability of the gross output is more obvious in Figure 34, which plots the percentage change in output between successive years. A period between a trough and a peak in economic activity is called an expansion. A period between the peak and the trough in economic activity is called a recession. When a recession is particularly severe, it is called a depression. The period from 1929 to 1933, during the Great Depression, has been the most severe episode of economic decline observed to date. The alternation of periods of expansion and recession is referred to as business cycle. These fluctuations are one of the fundamental features of the economy that macroeconomics seeks to explain. Because periods of recession are associated with declining employment opportunities and slower wage growth, a central focus of macroeconomic policy is to find ways to reduce the severity and duration of such cycles. Unemployment. Unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that would like to work but cannot find employment. The labor force is made up of all individuals who are employed or unemployed. When the employment rate is high, it's hard to find work, and people who do have jobs generally find it harder to earn promotions or increase their pay. Figure 35 shows the unemployment rate since 1900s. In general, the unemployment rate goes up during the recession and falls during expansions. You can see that the unemployment rate is especially high during the Great Depression. Figure 35 illustrates two other important points about the unemployment rate. First, the unemployment rate is never zero. There are always some people searching for work. This reflects the continual entry of new job seekers into the labor market, as well as the shifting fortunes of different industries, regions, and business within an economy. Even in expansions, some companies are closing, while others are growing. Even during the Great Depression, when many employers are laying off workers, others were expanding their workforce. Second, despite the huge changes that have taken place in the economy since 1900, there is no indication that the unemployment rate is increasing in the long term. Inflation. We have seen that the price of individual goods and services play a central role in coordinating individual choices within markets. When the price of a particular good, say a gallon of gasoline, rises, This increase signals consumers to reduce their consumption and creates incentives for suppliers to increase production. While all prices rise together, economists call this inflation, because inflation means that all the things people consume are becoming more expensive. Inflation reduces the purchasing power and makes people worse off. We will see that the inflation imposes other economic costs as well, so keeping inflation low is another important goal of the macroeconomic policy. Figure 36 shows the U.S. inflation rate since 1900. As this figure makes clear, the rate of inflation has varied considerably over time. Price generally increase over time, but there has been some periods during which the price level fell. Most notably, this occurred during the Great Depression, but we also saw the price level fall during the 2008 financial crisis. International trade. National economies are linked to one another through international trade. Because of its size, the United States is relatively less dependent on trade than many other smaller countries. While international trade has generally increased since the 1950s, the level of exports and imports as a share of GDP has fallen over the past few years in the United States. Figure 37 plots the volume of exports from United States to other countries and the volume of imports to United States since 1929 as a percentage of total output. When exports exceed imports, economists say that a country is running a trade surplus. When exports are less than imports, they say that a country is running on a trade deficit. In the long term, level of imports and exports appear to move in similar ways, but there has been shifts in their relative levels. Up until the late 1950s, the United States has generally exported more than it imported. Since the 1970s, the relationship has shifted, and imports are greater than exports. This means the United States is in a trade deficit, but this is not necessarily a bad thing because we are able to focus on exporting goods and services the country has a comparative advantage in producing. At the same time, we're able to trade for things that other countries can produce using less expensive resources. In our description of the behavior of the U.S. economy in the previous section, we make use of concepts like the total national output, inflation, and unemployment. Constructing measures that capture the overall behavior of the national economy involves aggregation. Aggregation is the combination of many different things into a single economic variable. Well-constructed economic aggregations help us see the bigger picture, but at the cost of obscuring important details. Important appropriate economic aggregate is an important branch of the macroeconomics, and understanding the choices that go into construction of these aggregates is important if we are to fully understand what their behavior tell us about the economy. In this section, we will describe in more detail how the most important macroeconomic variables are defined, and we will discuss the significance of these definitions. Measuring total output, gross domestic product. Earlier, we presented data showing the growth of the total output of the U.S. economy, but how can we measure the total output of an economy? How do we add up haircuts, personal computers, fast food, hamburgers, financial advice, automobiles, and the myriad of other goods and services produced by an economy? The answer that economists have developed to this question is called the gross domestic product, or GDP. Formally, GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specific period of time. This definition is short, but there are several important points about it. Market value. To combine all different types of things that a country produces, we use their dollar value to add them up. Suppose, for example, that an economy produced only two goods, t-shirts and shorts, and that t-shirts sell for $5 each, while shorts sell for $10. If the economy produced 100 t-shirts and 25 pairs of shorts, then its GDP would be 100 times $5 plus 25 times $10 equals $750. Because of the use of market prices, higher priced goods contribute more to total GDP. Recall from our discussion of microeconomics that the market price reflects the value that the marginal consumer places on the good. So goods that have higher prices have a higher value to consumers, and therefore should contribute more to total output. Final goods and services. Most of the product we consume are the result of complex chain production activities. For example, automakers purchase steel from refiners, who in turn purchase iron ore from a mining company. Because the automobile is the end product of this chain of purchases, we count only its value in GDP and exclude the purchase inputs that are used up to produce the car. Goods that are used up in the production of a final good are called intermediate goods. Excluding intermediate goods from the GDP ensures that our measure of GDP is not affected by the extent of vertical integration in the economy. This is important to avoid the possibility of double counting the value of some goods. To see this, consider the following alternative scenarios. First, suppose a steel producer sells $200,000 worth of steel to an auto manufacturer, and the auto manufacturer converts the steel into $1 million worth of automobiles. The steel is an intermediate good because it is used to produce the automobiles. Now, suppose the automaker produces its own steel and sells $1 million worth of automobiles. Notice that in both cases, the value of the steel is included in the value of the automobiles. By excluding the transaction involved in the intermediate goods, we arrive at the same contribution to GDP regardless of the pattern of industry ownership. Some goods can be either final goods or intermediate goods. In this case, we only count the portion of production that is sold to final users. As an example, suppose Sylvia raises tomatoes. One year, she produces $200 worth of tomatoes. She sells $100 worth at a local farmer's market and uses the other $100 worth to make tomato sauce, which she sells for $200. Sylvia's contribution to GDP is $300. As a result of adding the $100 worth of tomatoes she sells to consumers and the $200 worth of tomato sauce, we do not count directly the $100 worth of tomatoes used to produce the sauce, but it is reflected in the value of the final product that it is used to produce. Capital goods do not fit easily into either of the categories we have discussed so far. Capital goods are long-lived goods that are themselves produced and are used to produce other goods and services, but are not used up in production. Machinery and factory buildings are examples of capital goods. For the purpose of consistency, economists have adopted the convention that capital goods are included in the GDP in the year that they are produced. If we did not count them, then a country that invested in its future by building capital and equipment would appear to have a lower GDP than the one that has used all its resources to produce consumer goods. Within a country, the word domestic in gross domestic product indicates that we count only goods produced within the border of the country that we are discussing. So, the U.S. includes the value of all automobiles produced in the United States, whether made by an American auto manufacturer or by a foreignly owned one. During a specific period, production takes a certain amount of time, but we only include items that are produced between the beginning and the end of the period in question. Conventionally, economists consider either annual or quarterly, 3-month periods, GDP. An important implication is that the sale of goods produced in either period is not included in the GDP. For example, if a 20-year-old house is sold this year for $150,000, then this amount is not included in the GDP. The house was not produced this year. It was included in the GDP when it was produced, so we don't count it again when it changes hands. On the other hand, if the real estate agent who arranged the sale received 6% commission, this $9,000 fee is included in the GDP since the real estate services the agent provided are produced in the current year. Understanding what GDP measures. The conceptual basis for the measure of GDP was developed in the 1930s. Interest in the measuring of economic output is long-standing. However, one of the earliest known efforts to measure national output was undertaken by Sir William Petty in mid-1600s as part of the British government's effort to assess the ability of the Irish people to pay taxes to the Crown. Because the lack of comprehensive data on national economic activity was hampering efforts to respond to the Great Depression, in 1932, the U.S. Department of Commerce commissioned the economist Simon Kuznets to develop a system to measure national output. Kuznets presented his system in a report to the U.S. Senate in 1934. The U.S. entry into the Second World War provides an additional impetus for perfecting techniques of measuring output and establishing the necessary data collection tools to produce ongoing estimates of GDP. In 1971, Kuznets received the Nobel Prize in economic science as part of his contribution to the measurement of national production. The continued use of concepts developed by Kuznets and their subsequent refinement by other scholars reflects the practical value of these concepts. But it is important to recognize that despite the usefulness of these ideas, they have a number of important limitations. 3 of these are described below. First, as we have already noted, it is not always easy to determine what constitutes final goods and services. One illustration of this point is the treatment of expenditures on national defense. Conventionally, these are included in the GDP, but Kuznets pointed out that they might equally well be viewed as intermediate goods that enable citizens of a country to enjoy their final goods and services. The second limitation of GDP arises from its exclusion of goods that are not bought and sold in the markets, also referred to as non-market production. One very important example is the unpaid household work. Housekeeping and childcare performed by family members are not counted in the GDP, but if these services are purchased in the market, then they are. Over the past 60 years, as women have increasingly entered the paid labor force, the amount of commercially provided childcare and house cleaning has increased, causing the GDP to rise. But because some of this increase is simply a shift from non-market to market activity, it does not, in fact, reflect an increase in the total production. Another example is the underground economy, where people provide others with goods or services without reporting the transaction to the government. Some examples are mowing a neighbor's lawn or fixing a car for cash. Within the underground economy is the black market, where illegal activity takes place in exchange for payment. Third limitation of the conventional GDP measurement is that it ignores activities that may increase our GDP, but do not make us better off. Some examples include natural disasters and crime. GDP doesn't count for production that may deplete a country's stock of natural resources or pollute the environment. Although economic theory provides some guidance about how natural resources and environmental quality should be valued, actually measuring their value has proven more difficult. Other ways to measure GDP. Expenditure equals production. GDP is a measure of the quantity of goods and services produced in a country. But since goods that are produced are also purchased, we can also think of GDP as a measure of the total value of expenditures within a country. Economists divide purchasers into 4 categories: households, firms, government, and the foreign sector, that is, the foreign purchasers of domestic products. Each of these categories corresponds to a category of spending. Household purchases are called consumption expenditures, or consumption for short. These purchases are subdivided between the consumer durables and non-durables and services. Consumer durables are long-lived consumer goods, such as automobiles, washing machines, and furniture. Consumer durables often involve planning for purchase and are sensitive to changes in interest rates because the consumers may have to use credit to purchase them. Note that expenditures on new houses are included in investment rather than in consumer durables. Consumer non-durables are goods that are used up more quickly than durable goods, such as food or clothing. Services are intangible goods such as education, legal services, insurance, and financial services. Spending by firms on final goods and services, along with household purchases of new houses, comprise investment. Investment is subdivided into 3 categories. Business purchases of factories, offices, machinery, and equipment is called business fixed investment, or capital investment. Purchases of new home and apartment building is called residential fixed investment. The final category of investment is inventories, which consist of addition of unsold goods to company inventories. Notice that economists' use of the word investment is somewhat different from the world's use in ordinary conversation. In ordinary conversation, we often described the purchase of financial assets, such as shares of bonds and stocks, as making an investment. Such purchases transfer ownership of an existing financial or physical asset, but do not create new assets. In economics, the term investment is reserved for the purchase of new capital goods, such as buildings or equipment. Often, this type of investment involves borrowing from banks to make these large purchases. This makes capital investment sensitive to interest rates. Firms prefer lower interest rates on business loans to invest in capital. Government purchases. include all goods and services purchased by federal, state, and local government. These include wages paid to firefighters and teachers, and purchases of fighter planes to the military. In addition to purchasing goods and services, government makes transfer payments, such as paying Social Security benefits. These transfer payments are not counted in the government purchase of goods and services, and neither is interest paid on government debt. Net exports is the difference between the value of domestically produced goods sold to foreigners, exports, and the value of foreign-produced goods purchased by domestic buyers, inputs. If a country has a trade surplus, then exports exceed imports, and the number is positive. Conversely, a trade deficit where the export is less than imports means net export is negative. The relationship between GDP and the various categories of spending can be summarized by the equation GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX, where C is consumption, I is investment, G is government spending, and NX is net exports. Yet another way to measure GDP. Income equals production equals expenditures. We have seen that GDP can be measured either in terms of production or spending. In addition, GDP can be thought of as income, whether a good or service is sold. The revenue is distributed between the workers and the owners of the capital used to produce it. Except for some minor technical adjustments, the combined income of labor and capital equals expenditures, which equals production. As a result, we can state the following important identity. GDP equals production equals expenditures equals income. For this reason, economists use three different designations interchangeably when discussing the nation's GDP. Real GDP. Recall that GDP is calculated by adding up the market value of all goods and services produced or purchased in a country during a specified period. As a result, the size of the result sums depends on both quantity of goods and services produced and their respective prices. Because economists are often interested in comparing the level of economic activity over time or between different locations, it is important to have a way to separate the effects of changes in price from the changes in quantity of goods and service produced. The problem posed by changing prices is illustrated in the example shown on the top panel of Figure 38. This table reports prices and quantities for an economy producing just two goods in 2 years between 2015 and 2020. GDP tripled, raising from $750 to $2,250. But if you look more closely at the quantity data, you can see that output of both t-shirts and shorts has doubled, because the price increased by 50%. However, GDP tripled while the physical volume of production doubled. In this case, it is simple to isolate the effect of changes in physical quantity of production from the effects of changes in prices. But in most situations, the quantities produced of some goods are increasing while others are decreasing. Prices, too, will not change in a consistent way. To isolate the effect of changes in production from changes in prices, economists construct real GDP by using prices from a single year to value production in each year. This year is called the base year. For the example from Figure 38, if we use the prices in 2015 as the base year, then real GDP in 2020 will be calculated by taking 2020 levels of production and multiplying by 2015 prices of each good. For example, the real GDP in 2020 equals 200 times $5 plus 50 times $10 equals $1,500, twice the real GDP in 2015, and consistent with the doubling production of each good. The bottom panel of Figure 38 illustrates the calculation of real GDP in a more complicated situation where production does not grow at the same rate for different goods. In this case, the quantity of t-shirts doubles, while the quantity of shorts produced triples. Using 2015 prices as the base year, GDP in 2020 is now $1,750, equals 200 times $5 plus 75 times $10. To clearly distinguish the current year GDP from real GDP, economists commonly call GDP calculated with current year prices nominal GDP. As Figure 38 shows, nominal GDP in 2020 is $2,625. The increase in real GDP is $1,750 divided by $750 equals 2.33, which is somewhere between the quantitative increase of two products of the economy. Measuring inflation. To measure inflation, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics calculate the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, each month. The CPI measures the cost of purchasing a market basket of goods and services intended to be representative of the consumption of a typical consumer. To identify the consumption of the market basket, the Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts a periodic survey of consumer expenditures in which a sample of households conducts careful records of all of their expenditures. These responses are then aggregated to create a picture of the types and the amounts of goods and services purchased each month by representative households. Different market baskets are calculated for consumers at different income levels, and for those living in different parts of the country to reflect differences in consumption patterns. Each month, BLS employees visit stores, checks websites, and otherwise collect actual price information, including any temporary discount offered by retailers, for all of the items in the market basket of goods determined by Consumer Expenditure Survey. The BLS then combines these price data with quantities in the market basket to calculate the cost of purchasing the bundle of goods and services. Finally, the cost is expressed as an index number relative to the cost of the bundle in the base year. Figure 39 illustrates this calculation for an economy in which the consumption bundle consists of three items: pants, t-shirts, and shoes. We see that the quantity consumed each month is 2 pairs of pants, 3 t-shirts, and 1 pair of shoes. Using 2015 as the base year, we set the cost of the bundle in this year equal to 100, and calculate the CPI in the other years using the following formula. CPI in year T equals 100 times cost of bundle in year T divided by the cost of bundle in the base year. Notice that quantities of each item in the bundle determines the impact of that item's price change on the overall index. Because consumers purchase 3 t-shirts and only 1 pair of shoes, the change in price of t-shirts will cause a larger change in the CPI than will an equivalent dollar increase in the price of shoes. The CPI is of considerable practical importance to our economy. Each year, Social Security benefit payments are adjusted to reflect changes in the cost of living as reflected in the CPI. Similarly, many union employment contracts include cost of living adjustment provisions that tie wage increase to CPI. More informally, employers and employees take into account changes in the CPI when considering adjustment in wage rates. The rate of change in CPI from one time period to another is called the inflation rate. To calculate the inflation rate, use the following formula. Inflation rate equals 100 times CPI year 2 minus CPI year 1 divided by CPI year 1. The goal of the CPI is to measure how changes in price affect the ability of households to maintain the level of well-being they enjoyed in the base year that the CPI actually measures. However, is how the change in prices affect cost of a fixed bundle of goods and services. This difference means that CPI will typically overstate the true increase in cost of living. This upward bias in CPI arises for 3 reasons. The first factor causing the CPI to overstate the effect of rising prices on the cost of living is substitution bias. As relative price change, households will shift their consumption away from more expensive goods and services and toward less expensive ones. When the price of beef increases, for example, families will consume more chicken. When airline tickets price decline, consumers will choose to fly more and drive less. By adjusting their consumption toward less expensive goods, households can achieve the same level of well-being at a cost that is lower than the cost of buying a fixed basket of goods and services. The second source of upward bias in the CPI is unmeasured quantity change. Many goods and services get better over time due to technological change. In the past several decades, for example, personal computers have steadily become more powerful because of increased processor speeds, greater storage, and better software. Similarly, the addition of anti-lock brakes airbags, satellite radio, and GPS systems has substantially improved the quality of the typical automobile. Such quality improvements would be expected to raise the price of these goods, so a simple comparison of prices between one year and the next will overstate the price increase to understate any decline in prices. Although BLS statisticians try to account for these quality changes, they are very difficult to remove completely from the CPI. The third reason the CPI overstates the true rate of inflation is because of the introduction of new goods and services. A striking example of this is the cell phone. The first cell phones are introduced in the mid 1970s. Prior to this, mobile communication was simply unavailable at any price for most consumers. Because cell phones did not exist, they were not included in the market basket used by BLS to calculate the CPI. During the early years of their development, prices for cell phones fell rapidly, and the quality of service vastly improved. But because cell phones were not included in the CPI, none of these effects were reflected in measures of inflation. Only after cell phones has achieved relatively large market penetration were they added to the CPI basket. In 1996, the Boskin Commission, headed by economist Michael Boskin, carefully reviewed the methods used to calculate CPI and concluded that combined effects of substitution bias, quality improvement, and the introduction of new goods meant that CPI overstated the rate of price inflation by 1.3% per year. The CPI is just one way that economists measure changes in the cost of living. The relationship between real and nominal GDP provides a slightly different perspective on inflation. This measure is called the GDP deflator, and it is defined by the following equation. Nominal GDP equals GDP deflator divided by 100 times the real GDP. That is, we define the GDP deflator to be an index number such that when we multiply the real GDP by that index number, we get the nominal GDP. Dividing both sides by equation by the real GDP and multiplying both sides by 100, we state this relationship as the GDP deflator equals 100 times nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Figure 40 compares the rate of inflation as measured by CPI and GDP deflator since the 1960s. As this comparison illustrates, we tell similar stories about the cost of living, but the GDP deflator is somewhat less volatile, raising less at peaks and decelerating less at low points. Over the entire period, the GDP deflator has risen somewhat less than the CPI. There are several reasons for these differences. The first difference is that the GDP deflator reflects only the price of domestically produced goods, to the extent that foreign produced goods have a larger role in the CPI market basket. Differences in their behavior will show up in differences in the two indexes. One reason the CPI rose so much more than GDP deflator at the beginning and the end of 1970s is that raising oil prices had a large effect on the CPI, but because this is mainly product overseas, it did not affect the GDP deflator. The second reason the GDP deflator and CPI diverge has to do with the way they weight the prices of different goods and services. Whereas the CPI uses a fixed market basket of goods to weigh the prices of different goods, the GDP deflator weighs the price by their current level of production. As a result, the market basket of goods used to weigh prices in GDP deflator adjusts to changing consumption patterns over time. Unemployment. Macroeconomists use a variety of indicators to gauge the state of the economy. The unemployment rate is an especially sensitive indicator of how well the economy is performing at any moment. When the unemployment rate is low, workers feel secure in their jobs, and competitions between employers help drive up wages. When the unemployment is high, however, workers worry about losing their jobs. The unemployment rate is defined as the percentage of labor force that is unable to find a job. The labor force, in turn, consists of all working age adults who are either employed or are actively seeking work. In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is responsible for measuring the unemployment rate. To do this each month, BLS surveys approximately 60,000 households. Based on a series of questions, interviewers classify each person aged 16 or older in the household into one of three categories. Employed. If that person worked for pay, either full or part-time during the previous week, or is on vacation or sick leave from a regular job. Unemployed. If that person did not work during the previous week but made some efforts to find paid employment during the past 4 weeks. Out of the labor force. If that person did not work during the past week and did not actively seek work during the previous 4 weeks. Together, these three categories comprise the working age population. The sum of the employed and unemployed constitutes the labor force, and the unemployment rate is the quantity of people unemployed expressed as a percentage of labor force. Figure 41 shows data on the U.S. labor force collected by the BLS in July 2020. The table shows that there are approximately 260 million working age persons in the United States. Of course, almost 160 million are in the labor force. The ratio of those in the labor force to the working age population is called the labor force participation rate, which is about 61.4%. Of those in the labor force, about 143.5 million had jobs, while 16.3 million were unemployed, resulting in an unemployment rate of 10.2%. Just 1 year earlier, the unemployment rate was only 3.4%, so this significant increase in the fraction of labor force that is unemployed reflects the significant economic damage caused by COVID-19 pandemic. Note that the unemployment rate is highest among the teenage population, and it varies by race, ethnicity, and gender. There are many reasons why some people are unemployed. Economists divide these reasons into three broad categories. Frictional unemployment. The U.S. economy is remarkably dynamic. Every month, several million workers leave their jobs either voluntarily, i.e. they quit, or involuntarily, i.e. they get laid off, and several million more get hired. Because job searching takes time, many workers show up as unemployed for brief periods of time. An additional source of frictional unemployment comes from new workers entering the labor force for the first time. Frictional unemployment refers to the portion of unemployed who are currently not working because the normal process of matching employees and employers. Structural unemployment. Sometimes the jobs that are available require different skills or characteristics from those possessed by the workers who are seeking employment. The locations of job seekers and vacancies may also be different, preventing those seeking employment from filling the available positions. The portion of total unemployment attributed to the mismatch between job openings and job seekers is called the structural unemployment. In 1980s, for example, the U.S. steel industry was contracting while computer industry was expanding. Not only were the laid-off steel workers located in the industrial northeast far from the expanding Sunbelt industries, but many of them also lacked the skills to pursue such jobs. If self-driving vehicles began to replace Uber drivers in the coming years, then those drivers will be structurally unemployed as a result of long-term changes in the structure of the economy, in this case due to automation. This is also referred to as creative destruction. Cyclical unemployment. During recessions, unemployment rises as layoffs increase and new hires decline. In these circumstances, job seekers find it harder to find employment, and many of them spend longer searching for work. The additional unemployment that occurs for this reason is called cyclical unemployment. Frictional and structural unemployment are normal and generally positive parts of the economy. Together, they represent the natural rate of unemployment, NRU. The NRU varies from country to country, but is generally a sustainable level of unemployment. If the actual unemployment rate falls below the NRU, the economy experiences pressure to raise prices, and inflation may occur. If the actual unemployment rate rises above the NRU, the economy could potentially experience a recession due to increased cyclical unemployment. To determine the amount of cyclical unemployment in an economy, deduct the natural rate of unemployment from the actual rate of unemployment. Economic growth, productivity, and living standards. Would you prefer to have an average income in the United States today, or to have been the richest person living in the 1900s? Earlier we saw, figure 31, that real GDP per capita grew by a factor of 9 between 1900s and 2019. In other words, the value of goods and services available to the average person today is 9 times as large as what the average citizen will consume in the 1900s. But this comparison hardly captures the change that has taken place in our economy and consumption patterns over the past century. In the 1900s, even the wealthiest American citizen would not go to the movies, would not travel from the United States to Europe in a single day, watch television, use a computer, or get antibiotics to treat an infection. How much income would it take to compensate you to live without computers, internet, modern medicine, and all the conveniences that we take for granted today that were not available 100 years ago? Many people will conclude that no level of financial incentive could induce them to give up all those modern conveniences. The improvement in living standard that has taken place in the United States in the last century is a manifestation of a broader phenomenon that economists call economic growth. The phenomenon of a sustained economic growth began a little more than 200 years ago in the United States and Western Europe. During the 19th and 20th centuries, it spread to Japan and parts of Latin America, and since 1950s, a growing number of countries around the world. Yet when we look around the world, there is still a strikingly large variation in the material well-being and living standard. In this section of the resource guide, we will look at what economists know about the factors that account for differences in the standard of living over time and between countries. That is, we will develop a theory that explains the size of a nation's economy in the long run. The circular flow model of the economy. A useful starting point for our discussion is a conceptual model of the economy called the circular flow model, which is depicted in Figure 32. By tracing the flow of dollars through the economy, this diagram illustrates the schematically and complex set of interactions between the larger sets of the economic actors in our economy: households, firms, and the government. In this diagram, the major actors are depicted by rectangles, while the market through which they interact is depicted as ovals. Flows of money and flows of real things, goods and services, inputs to production, are drawn as arrows. To understand this model, begin on the left-hand side with households. Households receive income by providing factors of production, labor, capital, land to firms. This transaction is reflected in the arrow leading from the households box to the factors market, and the parallel arrow labeled income in the other direction. Even though firms purchase many of the capital goods in our economy, those capital goods are owned indirectly by households through their ownership of the firms, and it is appropriate to depict the households as providing these capital to the firms in exchange for rental payments. Households use their income to purchase goods and services and to pay taxes. These uses of their income are illustrated by the arrows leading out of the box labeled households. Firms receive revenue from the sale of goods and services, the arrow leading from the market for goods and services, and use this income to pay for the factors of production that they must hire to produce the goods and services that they sell. The government receives revenue from the households in the form of taxes, and the government borrow from financial markets and businesses it uses as these sources of revenue to purchase goods and services that it uses to run the government and to provide public goods and public services. What determines how much an economy produces? As the circular flow model emphasizes, an economy's output depends on the total quantity of goods and services that firms are able to produce. This, in turn, depends on the quantity of factor inputs that households are able to supply to the firms, and the ability of the firms to transform these inputs into outputs that households and government chooses to produce. Larger economies will produce more, other things being equal, than smaller economies, but this source of variation cannot account for differences in GDP per capita. To explain differences in GDP per capita, it is helpful to note that the real GDP per capita is equal to the real GDP per worker multiplied by the fraction of the population employed. Let POP stand for the country's population, and N stand for the labor force. Then we can express this relationship in the following equation. GDP divided by population equals GDP divided by labor force multiplied by labor force divided by population. The left-hand side of this equation is just real GDP per capita, but canceling out n in the two fractions on the right-hand side, we can see that the right-hand side reduces to GDP per capita as well, so this relationship is always true. What this expression tells us is that the average quantity of goods and services available for each person to consume depends on the average amount that each worker can produce, or average labor productivity, and the proportion of the population that is engaged in production. Most variations in the GDP per capita occurs because of differences in average labor productivity. In the United States, labor force participation rate have increased modestly in the last century as more women have entered the labor force, and as lower birth rates have reduced the share of children in the population and consequently increased the relative size of the working age population. These trends have, however, been offset by earlier retirement and longer education. As a result, virtually all of the increase in output per person in the economy is explained by increased average labor productivity. Figure 43 shows that there is also a strong positive association between labor productivity and real GDP per capita across countries. Average labor productivity depends on a number of different factors. The most predominant of these are the following: physical capital, workers equipped with more and better tools, machinery, and up-to-date factories will be more productive. Modern manufacturing methods rely on the use of large quantity of capital per worker to achieve high levels of production. In service industries, computers are necessary to stay efficient and competitive. Recall that the capital equipment is a produce factor of the production, so it is an input that in the past was an output of production process. As such, increasing the capital stock in the future requires giving up consumption in the present. Human capital. Human capital is a term that economists use to refer to the skills and experiences that are acquired through education, training, and on-the-job experience. Unlike physical capital, human capital is not tangible, but like physical capital, creating it usually requires sacrificing current consumption. Human capital investment is very important in combination with physical capital investment. If firms spend money on new equipment without proper working training, the company may end up less productive. Students and trainees must reduce the amount of time they engage in productive activities while they're learning. Natural resources. Some countries or regions have natural resources like iron ore, petroleum, or natural gas reserves that contribute to the wealth of their citizens. The high standards of living of countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are in large part due to the fact that they're located on large pools of oil. On the other hand, in an increasingly global world, natural resources are not essential to a high standard of living. Countries like Japan has been able to achieve high levels of per capita income by importing raw materials produced elsewhere. Technical knowledge. Economists refer to the knowledge about techniques by which inputs are transformed into goods and services households desire as technical knowledge, or simply technology. Advances in this knowledge are the single most important factor in raising average labor productivity historically. These advances include innovation of entirely new products like semiconductors, integrated circuits, lasers, and genetic engineering, as well as the development of better methods of organization, such as Henry Ford's introduction of the world's moving assembly line. Political and legal environment. Some kinds of technological knowledge are protected by patents, and others may be kept as trade secrets. But most of the know-how behind the high levels of productivity in advanced countries like the United States is available to be learned and copied. The very rapid growth of living standards in Japan, South Korea, and China illustrates that companies can catch up quickly if they successfully borrow and adapt these techniques. Yet, the persistent poverty of other countries implies that there are obstacles to successful borrowing. The most persuasive explanation for this is the dysfunctional political and legal system prevent many countries from fully exploiting the potential of modern manufacturing techniques. A stark illustration of this point is the divergent fortunes of the North and South Korea. After World War II, both countries had similar resources, populations, and standards of living. Today, South enjoys a standard of living comparable with the world's most developed countries, while poverty is widespread in the North. This variance is most entirely due to the differences in governmental institutions. The importance of political and legal environment illustrates that creating the appropriate incentive is an essential prerequisite for achieving high standards of living. But what actions should policymakers seek to encourage? Investment in both physical and human capital would be encouraged, but only up to a point. Recall that capital is created as part of the production process, so creating more capital to use in the future requires giving up current consumption. In the extreme, if all of our current output were directed to investment, there would be no goods and services available to consume, and we would all starve. Long before this, however, diminishing returns would make it undesirable to keep investing. Similarly, investment in creation of new technological knowledge through research and development (R&D) is desirable because the new knowledge is a true public good, since the utility of a discovery is not diminished by other people knowing it. Private incentives to create new knowledge may lead to underinvestment. As a result, there is an important role for the government to play in encouraging R&D either through tax credits, subsidies, direct expenditures, or legal protections, such as patent system that give investors a temporary monopoly on the exploitation of their inventions in exchange for the disclosure of their discovery. Savings, investment, and financial system. As the preceding discussion makes clear, the quantity of resources that an economy directs toward the formation of capital, both physical and human, and toward the creation of new technological knowledge, plays a central role in determining the rate of growth of productivity and hence the standard of living. In essence, we face, both as individuals and collectively, trade-offs between how much we consume today and how much will be available to consume tomorrow. Devoting more resources to capital formation or to research and development means that there are fewer goods and services available to consume today, but there will be more in the future. Recall that economists use the term saving and investment somewhat differently from how they're used in common conversation. To economists, saving is what happens when someone has more income than you wish to spend. Someone in this situation might put the money they don't want to spend now in a bank, or they might use it to buy shares of stock in a company. They might think of this as investing their money, but to an economist, the term investment is reserved to describe the purchase of new capital equipment. So it is only when a bank lends money to a business to construct a new factory, or when a company uses the funds they receive from sales of stock, that investment takes place. A variety of different financial institutions help to coordinate the saving and investment decisions within our company. It will be helpful to begin our discussion by examining several of these institutions in more detail. Financial markets. Financial markets are institutions through which individuals who have money they wish to save can supply these funds directly to persons or companies that wish to borrow money for investment. The bond market. When a large corporation, like Walmart, wants to borrow money to finance the construction of a new store, it can borrow directly from the public. It does this by selling bonds. A bond is a certificate of indebtedness that specifies the obligation of the borrower to the holder of the bond. In other words, it is sort of IOU. The typical bond specifies when the loan will be repaid, called the date of maturity, and the rate of interest to be paid periodically until the loan is repaid. The purchaser of the bond gives the company their money in exchange for the promise of repayment of the original amount, called the principal, and the periodic interest payments. The purchaser can hold the bond until maturity, or they can sell the bond to someone else. As the market interest rates change, the price at which the bond can be sold change to equate the promised payments of the bond within the new interest rate. The principal on the bond is the face or par value, i.e. the amount a bond issuer promises to pay at maturity, expiration. It is not necessarily the amount of money the bond purchaser initially provided to the seller. Bonds are sold at a discount compared to the face value, with the discount determined by interest rate. The higher the prevailing market interest rates, the steeper the discount on the bond face value. When selling a bond, higher market interest rate on the new bond means that the price of previously issued bonds will be lower, and vice versa. This means that the price of a bond is inverse to interest rate to make the previously issued bond attractive to investors. Some bonds also promise to make payments to bondholders that are unattached to the discount rate. These payments are defined as coupon rates and are determined by the issuer of the bond. This potential variation in the value of a bond is a risk that buyer assumes. The longer the maturity of the bond is, the greater the risk of such changes in price, and the higher the interest rate that borrowers must pay to induce people to lend them money. The buyer of a bond also assumes the risk that the borrower may fail to pay some or all of the principal or interest on the bond. The probability that the borrower will default on their obligation by declaring bankruptcy depends on the financial conditions of the borrower. The greater the risk is, the higher the rate of interest a borrower must pay to compensate lenders for this risk. Because the U.S. government is considered a safe credit risk, it can generally borrow at lower rates than private companies. By contrast, financially shaky corporations must pay higher interest rates. The stock market. Walmart and other companies can also raise funds by issuing shares of stock and selling them to savers. Each share of stock represents ownership of a portion of a firm. If a company issues 10 million shares of stock, then each share represents the ownership of 1/10,000,000th of the business. The sale of shares of stock is called equity finance, whereas the sale of bonds is called debt finance. Most companies use both equity and debt finance because the two methods of borrowing funds have two very different characteristics. The purchasers of a share of Walmart becomes a part owner of the company. If Walmart is profitable, then shareholders enjoy the benefits of these profits either through the payments of dividends or through an increase in the value of their shares. The bondholders only receive their interest payments. If, however, Walmart runs into financial difficulties, the bondholders are paid before the stockholders receive any dividend payments. Purchases of stock face greater risk than purchases of bonds, but also have a greater potential for higher returns. Someone who buys shares of stock in a corporation can sell these shares on the organized stock exchange, such as the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE, or NASDAQ, National Association of Securities Dealers automated quotation system. The price at which they can sell shares depend on the supply of and demand for shares in the company. These, in turn, respond to the current profits and future prospects of the company. It is important to recognize that when shares of stock are traded on the stock exchange, the company does not receive any revenue from these transactions. Consequently, this transaction does not contribute to investment. Only new shares of stock contribute to a nation's investment. The ability of shareholders to easily buy and sell shares of stock on organized exchanges does, however, contribute to their willingness to hold these assets by making it easier for them to access the wealth that they represent. Financial intermediaries. An intermediary is a third party who acts as a link between two others. In developed countries, there are a great variety of intermediaries who help to link savers and borrowers. Two of the most important intermediaries are banks and mutual funds. Banks. Many small businesses, such as local construction companies or retail stores, are too small to issue bonds. When these businesses need to borrow money to finance investment that they are undertaking, they are likely to turn to a bank. Banks get the funds that they lend by accepting deposits from people who have money they wish to save. Banks pay their depositors interest and charge borrowers more money than they pay to depositors. The difference between the interest rate banks charge and what they pay depositors covers the cost of accepting deposits and making loans, as well as the risk that some borrowers may be unable to repay their loans, and provides profit for the bank owners. Because most bank deposits are fully insured and can be withdrawn at any time, depositors correctly view them as having little or no risk. The value of the deposit does not fluctuate with the fortunes of the bank's borrowers and all of the risks that are borne by the bank's owners. In addition to their roles as financial intermediaries, banks serve another important function in the economy. They facilitate purchases of goods and services by providing checking accounts. We will discuss this aspect of bank activities in greater detail in a later section of this guide when we turn our attention to monetary institutions. Mutual funds. Mutual funds provide a way for savers with small amounts of money to purchase bonds and stocks that would otherwise be difficult for them to purchase. Mutual funds purchase a portfolio of stocks and bonds and sell shares to savers. The value of mutual funds shares fluctuate with the value of the portfolio of assets that it owns. Mutual fund shareholders assume all of the risk of variation in the value of the shares. Mutual funds are attractive to savers with small amounts of money for two reasons. First, mutual funds make it possible to achieve higher degree of diversification than would be feasible through a direct purchase of stocks and bonds. Holding the stock or bond of a single company is risky because the value of financial assets depends on the fortune of that one company. Diversification reduces the potential of ups and downs because some company will do well when others are suffering. For instance, discount retailers like Walmart find that their sales may actually be rising during recessions, while department stores that cater to more upscale tastes see their sales fall. By diversifying, savers can avoid tying the value of their assets to the ups and downs of a single business. The second advantage of savings through mutual fund is that it provides access to knowledge and insight of professional money managers. The skill and knowledge of these professionals means that individuals do not have to closely follow the market developments. Saving and investment in aggregate. Saving occurs when an individual earns more than they wish to spend. Investment occurs when businesses or households purchase capital equipment or pay for construction of new buildings. Before considering how financial markets coordinate independent saving and investment decisions, we need to consider how saving and investments are measured at the aggregate level. Recall that for an economy, production GDP is equal to the income and to expenditure. We can express the equity of income and expenditure mathematically in the following expression: y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. In this equation, y stands for income, C is consumption expenditures, I is investment, G is government purchases, and NX is net exports. By virtue of the definition of these quantities, this quantity is an identity. It is always true. To simplify, we will begin by assuming that the economy is closed. That is, it does not engage in any international trade. As a result, net export is zero, and the identity between income and expenditure can be written as y equals c plus I plus g. Subtracting c plus g from both sides of this expression, we obtain y minus c minus g equals I. The left-hand side of this expression, y minus c minus g, is national savings, S, since it is the difference between income, y, and expenditure by households, C, and government, G. In other words, the identity between income and expenditure implies a second important identity: savings equals investment. Writing in symbols, this would be S equals I, because this is an identity. By definition, it is always true. Further insights about this identity can be gleaned by some further rearrangement. In the expression above, we add and subtract net taxes, T, from both the left and the right side of the expression to obtain S equals y minus c minus g equals y minus c minus t plus parentheses t minus g. The second and third expression are equal because the two t terms in the last expression cancels each other out. We can interpret this expression as saying that saving is equal to the sum of private saving, y minus c minus t, and the government spending, t minus g. Private saving is the amount of money households have left over after they pay for their taxes and pay for their consumption, while taxes are an expenditure from the perspective of households, their income from the government. And the differences between the government income, T, and the government purchases, G, is called government saving. If T minus G is a positive number, then we say that the government runs on a budget surplus. If T minus G is negative, then we say that it runs a budget deficit. One important implication that emerges from breaking down savings into its components is that when the government runs a deficit, it reduces investment in the economy, which reduces growth rate of living standards. International capital flows in an open economy. In an open economy, domestic savings no longer have to equal domestic investment because the possibility of international borrowing or lending. Nevertheless, there is an important parallel to the relationships we have just described, and one that closely relates to the price level of international trade with domestic investment. In an open economy, residents interact with citizens of other countries either in the world markets for goods and services or in the world financial market, in the same way that net exports measures the difference between the sales of domestically produced goods to foreigners and the purchase by domestic residents of foreign produced goods. We can define a second concept, net capital outflow. The net capital outflow equals the purchase of foreign capital or foreign assets by domestic residents minus the purchase of domestic assets by foreigners. When InBev, a Brazilian and Belgian-owned brewing company, purchased the U.S. company Anheuser-Busch, it resulted in the purchase of domestic assets by foreign residents. This purchase added to the purchase of domestic U.S. assets by foreigners. Since we subtract such purchases, the net capital outflow decreases. When Intel builds a new factory in Taiwan, this results in the purchase of foreign asset by domestic residents, so it increases the first term in this expression and increases the net capital outflow. There are two types of international capital flows: foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. Foreign direct investment is used to describe situations in which a company or individual acquires assets in a foreign country that they will manage actively. An example of foreign direct investment in the United States is the purchase of Rockefeller Center in New York by Japanese corporation Mitsubishi in 1989. Portfolio investment occurs when an individual or business purchases a share of stock or bonds issued by a foreign corporation. When the Chinese government purchases U.S. government bonds, it is making a portfolio investment. In an open economy, the net capital outflows, NCO, are precisely equal to the net exports, NX. This equality always holds because, like the equality of savings and investment, it is an identity. To see why, it is helpful to consider an example. Suppose that electronics importers purchase a container full of video games from a Japanese manufacturer and pays them $100,000. This purchase is an import, so it reduces net exports by $100,000. The Japanese video game producer could put the money in a safe. In this case, the owners of the company are using some of their income to invest in the U.S. economy by purchasing a domestic asset, U.S. currency. As a result, the net capital outflow decreased by $100,000, thus balancing the change in net exports. More realistically, the video game manufacturer might use the $100,000 to purchase the U.S. government bonds, or they might take the money to a bank and exchange it for yen. The company no longer has any dollars, but the situation has not really changed, since now the bank faces the same choices as the company about what to do with the funds. Another possible outcome is that the company uses the money to purchase U.S.-produced goods and services. For example, they might pay a U.S. advertising company to develop new advertisements. If they spend the entire amount of their revenue, then this causes U.S. exports of services to increase by $100,000, balancing earlier imports. In this case, neither the net exports nor net capital outflows change. For the economy as a whole, the amount of net capital outflows must exactly equal net exports. Returning the equality of income and expenditures for an open economy, we have y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. Rearranging the terms of this equation, we obtain y minus c minus g equals s equals I plus nx. But we have just shown that net exports equals net capital outflows, so we can replace nx with NCO to get s equals I plus NCO. This states that domestic saving equals domestic investment plus net capital outflows. In an open economy, savings can differ from an investment, but only to an extent that the differences is offset by net capital outflows. If foreigners are willing to lend to domestic citizens, so NCO is negative, then investment can be larger than savings. Of course, foreigners make such loans with expectation that they will be repaid at some point in the future, so eventually the situation will likely be reversed, with saving exceeding investment to produce positive capital outflows. How financial market coordinates saving and investment decisions. We have seen that by definition, saving must equal investment in a closed economy, and even in an open economy, saving and investment are closely linked with each other and with the net capital flow in and out of the economy. But what determines the level of savings and investment that occurs in an economy? For simplicity's sake, we will again focus on a closed economy, but the situation will be quite similar in an open economy. In reality, there are a large number of financial markets, but they are closely linked to one another because individuals with excess savings can easily move funds between markets to obtain the best return for their money, while borrowers can similarly choose between many different markets. As a result, it is convenient to collapse these many markets into a single financial market. In the financial market, the supply of savings and the demand for savings, that is, the demand by firms for funds to purchase or construct new capital or investment, are equalized through the adjustment of the interest rate. This is illustrated in figure 44. As before, we have graphed the quantity in dollars of supply, savings, and demand investment on the horizontal axis and the interest rate on the vertical axis. In the financial market, the interest rate functions as the price of a loan. It is the amount that borrowers must pay for the loan, and it is the amount that savers receive for making the loan. For a lender, the decision to save $1 today is, in effect, a decision to postpone consumption until some time in the future. Suppose the interest rate is 10% per year. A saver who lends $100 will receive $110 equals $100 times 1 plus 0.1 the following year. The possibility of consuming more in the future is one of the principal motivations for saving. Of course, if prices are rising, the same bundle of goods becomes more expensive next year. So what matters is the real interest rate, which is the nominal rate minus the rate of inflation. Economists refer to this as the Fisher equation. Real equals nominal minus inflation. If the prices increase 10% per year, then it will take $110 next year to purchase a bundle of goods that costs $100 today. In this case, the real interest rate will be 0, indicating that the saver receives no increase in purchasing power from postponing their consumption. The higher the real interest rate is, the higher the rewards for being patient. The greater the amount of people will choose to save. As a result, the supply of savings is drawn as an upward sloping line in figure 44. Businesses invest because they anticipate that the additional capital equipment they are acquiring will raise their revenues in the future. The price of making these investments is the real interest rate. So long as businesses expect that the additional revenue they will receive will exceed the cost of borrowing funds, businesses will be willing to borrow. The lower the real interest rate is, the larger the number of investment projects that businesses will find profitable to pursue. As a result, the demand curve for savings is drawn as downward sloping. In the same way that competitive forces move prices in other markets toward the market equilibrium level, there are strong pressure on the real interest rate that cause it to adjust to equilibrate the market. At an interest rate below the equilibrium level, borrowers will not be able to find enough savers willing to lend them funds. Shortage and competition to obtain the available funds will drive up the real interest rate. At an interest rate above the equilibrium, there will be an excess supply of funds, surplus, and competitions between lenders to find borrowers willing to take their funds would cause the real interest rate to fall. Now that we have seen how financial markets determine the real interest rate and the quantity of savings and investment, we're in a position to consider how various events affect this equilibrium. Figure 45 illustrates 3 possible changes in the market equilibrium. Panel A depicts the effect of a new technology that raises the productivity of capital. As a result, the demand for funds schedule shifts out to the right since the business will want to borrow more money at every interest rate to purchase the technology. Raising interest rate causes saving to rise, and the new equilibrium occurs at a higher interest rate and higher level of savings and investment. In panel B, we show the effect of an increase in the government deficit, or equivalently, a reduction in government saving. With the government saving less or borrowing more, the supply of saving in the economy is reduced at every interest rate, which is shown as a leftward shift in the supply of savings curve. Now the equilibrium shifts up and to the left. As a result, the interest rates are higher, and the total quantity of saving and investment in the economy is lower. The tendency of government deficit to reduce private investment is called crowding out. The third example we will consider is the effect of a government tax credit to encourage savings. More concretely, suppose that the government reduces tax rate on interest income earned on saving accounts. In this case, as illustrated in panel C, the supply of savings curve shifts out to the right. As a result, the interest rate falls while the saving and investment both increase. Money and prices in the long run. Having grown up in an advanced market economy, it does not surprise us at all that we can walk into a store and hand over some small green pieces of paper and walk out with valuable merchandise. Nor does it surprise us that the store owner will allow us to simply swipe a credit card through a magnetic slip reader or write a check in payment for the merchandise. Money is a remarkable innovation that greatly facilitates exchange in our economy. Without it, we would be forced to barter, find people who have items we wish to acquire, and those who are willing to accept something that we are willing to give up in return. Because money represents purchasing power, the quantity of money in circulation in an economy can have powerful influence on the level of economic activity. Too much money can lead to inflation, and too little money can lead to deflation. This section begins by defining more precisely what we mean by money. Then we will describe the forces that determine the quantity of money in an economy. Finally, we will consider how money affects price and output. What is money? While we all have intuitive sense of what money is, it is important in economic analysis to have a clearer and more precise definition. To economists, money is an asset that has three functions. It is a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. These functions distinguish money from other assets, such as stocks and bonds, paintings, real estate, and barrels of oil. Let's consider each functions of money. A medium of exchange. A medium of exchange is an item that buyers can use to purchase goods and services. For money to function as a medium of exchange, sellers have to be confident that they can use the money they receive to pay for the things they wish to purchase. The usefulness of money as a medium of exchange explains why people are willing to hold on to it even though it earns no interest. The ability to quickly and easily complete a transaction compensates us for the interest payment we give up. Unit of account. A unit of account is a yardstick used to establish the value of different goods and services. Expressing the price of goods and services in a common unit of account greatly facilitates the comparison of economic value. Using money as a unit of account is helpful when discussing things like salary, housing prices, and even clothing. One can make a lot of assumptions about a job based on the salary. The use of money as a medium of exchange is closely linked to its use as a unit of account. Because money is used to buy and sell things, it makes sense to express prices in money terms. Store of value. Store of value is an item that people can use to transfer purchasing power from the present into the future. When a seller accepts dollar bills today in exchange for a good or service, that seller can hold on to those bills for weeks or months before becoming a buyer. Paper currency is only one of the many stores of value, but unlike stocks or bonds, it pays no interest and offers no opportunity for appreciation in value. Economists use the term wealth to describe all of the different stores of value in the economy. An important characteristic that distinguish different assets that make up wealth is their liquidity. Liquidity is a measure of the ease with which an asset can be converted into the economy's medium of exchange. Currency is clearly the most liquid asset, but deposits held in checking accounts, most stocks and bonds, and shares of mutual funds can easily be used to complete transactions and are thus highly liquid. In contrast, real estate and collectible antiques require more effort to sell and are consequently less liquid. Throughout history, many things have functioned as money. These can be divided into two categories: commodity money and fiat money. When an item with some intrinsic value is used as money, it's called commodity money. The use of precious metals such as gold or silver is an example of commodity money. Similarly, during World War II, prisoners of war used cigarettes as money to trade goods and services with one another. When an item with no intrinsic value is used as money, it is called fiat money. A fiat is simply an order or decree. The value of dollar bills as a legal tender is established by government decree. Measuring money. To be able to analyze the effect of money on the economy, a first step is simply to be able to measure the amount of it. In the United States, the stock of money is made up of several components. The most obvious of these is currency, which includes the paper bills and coins in the hands of the public. But currency is not the only asset that functions as money. The wealth represented by your checking account is nearly as good as, if not better than, currency. By writing a check or swiping your debit card, you can use this wealth to make purchases in the same way you can use currency. Many other types of accounts, such as saving accounts or mutual fund accounts, are essentially equivalent to checking accounts. It is not easy to draw a line between assets that are money and those that are not. Dollar bills in your wallet are money, whereas your house is not. But there are many assets somewhere between these two extremes. For this reason, monetary economists have developed several different measures of stock of money in the economy. Most widely used are called M1 and M2. The table in Figure 46 lists the component of each. M2 includes all of the items in M1 plus a broad array of other assets. Notice that neither M1 nor M2 include credit card as part of the stock of money, even though credit card are often used to make purchases. The reason is that credit is a way of putting off a payment, like a short-term loan. When you pay for your groceries with a credit card, the bank that issued the card pays the supermarket, and then at a later date you pay the bank. Although credit cards are not part of this money stock, people who use them are able to pay many of their bills at one time, and they are therefore likely to hold less currency than they otherwise would. To this extent, a credit card helps to reduce the economy's need for money. The Federal Reserve System, banks, and the supply of money. The amount of money in the U.S. economy is determined by the interaction between the public commercial banks and the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System, often called Fed, is the central bank of the United States. A central bank is an institution created to oversee the banking system and regulate the supply of money. The Federal Reserve System was created in 1913 and consists of 12 regional banks, each separately incorporated with its own board of directors and the Federal Board in Washington, D.C. The Fed is run by a board of governors that consists of 7 members who are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Governors' term are 14 years, which helps to ensure that the action of the Federal Reserve System are insulated from political pressure. The 12 regional banks are largely responsible for overseeing commercial banks in their respective regions and for facilitating transactions by clearing checks. They also act as a sort of banker's bank, making loans to banks when they wish to borrow funds. When a member bank is unable to obtain funds from other sources, the Federal Reserve Bank acts as a lender of last resort to maintain the stability of the overall banking system. The task of controlling the quantity of money in the economy, called money supply, is the responsibility of the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. The FOMC is composed of 7 governors of the Fed plus 5 regional bank presidents. The president of the New York Fed is always a member, but the other 4 places on the FOMC rotates among the remaining banks. The FOMC meets about every 6 weeks in Washington, D.C. to assess the state of the economy and determine if any changes in monetary policy are necessary. When FOMC decides that money supply should be adjusted, the Fed achieves this goal through adjustment of administrative rates. If the Fed wishes to stimulate a recessionary economy, then it lowers the discount rate and the interest rate on reserves. As a result, banks are less incentivized to hold money in reserves and instead loan it out to customers and businesses. The amount of currency and deposits in the hands of public increases. Conversely, if the Fed reduces the inflationary pressure in an economy, it will reverse the process, raising administrative rates to encourage banks to hold more money in their reserve. This is also called the ample reserve policy. The tool used and how they're implemented are different in countries that have limited reserves in their banking system. Central banks using limited reserve policy will use open money operations as their primary tool to adjust the money supply. If the central bank wishes to increase the money supply, then it purchases government bonds from banks or the public. This will increase the amount of currency and deposits in the hands of the public. The reverse is true to reduce the money supply. Let's begin considering how banks affect the money supply. To begin, let's suppose that there are no banks and that money supply consists of $100 of currency. Now suppose that someone established a bank offering depositors a safe place to store their currency. The bank accepts currency and stores it in the vault. When a depositor wants to make a purchase, the depositor goes to the bank, withdraw the necessary funds, and use them to make a purchase. After the transaction is completed, the seller takes the funds and deposits them in their account within the bank. We can summarize the bank's financial position as shown in Figure 47. In this table, there are two columns. On the left, we list the bank's assets, while on the right, we list the bank's liabilities. The bank's assets consist of the $100 in cash that it holds in the vault, and its liabilities are the $100 in deposits that the depositors can withdraw at any time. The bank's assets and liabilities are in balance. Whether people hold currency or place it in the bank accounts, money supply in this economy is $100. The situation depicted in Figure 47 is simple, but it doesn't offer the bank's owners much opportunity to earn a profit, and they will have noticed that most of the money on deposit remains unused. Instead of holding all $100 in deposits, they would lend some of this out to the people who wish to borrow funds to purchase a house, pay for college, or make some other major purchase. The bank needs to keep some reserves or money in the vault to be able to pay its depositors, but this is likely only a small fraction of total deposits. This is a key characteristic of a fractional reserve banking system. Suppose that the bank owners determine that they need to hold reserves equal to just 20% of their liabilities. Then they can lend out $80 to borrowers and receive interest rate on this. Figure 48 illustrates the bank's situation now. On the right-hand side, the banks still have $100 in liabilities, but now its assets consist of $20 in reserves and $80 in loans. Once again, assets and liabilities exactly balance. Notice, however, what has happened to the money supply. The bank's deposits have $100 in deposits, and its borrower have $80 in currency. The money supply has grown to $180. By holding only a fraction of deposits in its reserves, bank is able, in effect, to create money. This may seem too good to be true, but it is important to understand that while the bank has created money, it has not created any more wealth. The borrower have an additional $80 in assets, the money they have borrowed, but they also have an additional $80 in liabilities, the debt they have to repay. Because of fractional reserves, the bank makes the economy more liquid, but it doesn't increase the total amount of wealth in the economy. The process of money creation does not stop with the initial loans made by the bank. Its borrowers may deposit loans in another account until they make a purchase with the funds, or, once they have made a purchase, the seller will deposit the funds that they receive in their bank account. Figure 48b shows that now the bank's liability have increased to $180, and its asset has grown to $180 as well. $100 in revenues and $80 in loans. With $180 in liabilities, the 20% reserve ratio suggests that the bank would hold reserves equal to $36, which means that it can lend an additional $64. Figure 48c shows the situation once it has made these loans, its liability remained the same, but now it has $144 in loans and $36 in reserves. At this point, the money supply has increased by $64, reflecting the additional loans the bank has made. In due course, the additional funds that a bank has loaned will find their way back to the bank as additional deposits, and the cycle of loans and money creation will continue until the total deposits equals $500, and the bank has $100 in reserves and $400 in loans. At this point, the bank cannot make any additional loans without falling below its 20% reserve ratio. The amount of money the banking sector creates from each dollar reserves is called the money multiplier. The money multiplier is the reciprocal of reserve ratio. If R is the reserve ratio, then each dollar of reserve will support 1 over R of money supply. In the example above, the voluntary reserve ratio for the banks is 20%, so the money multiplier is 1 over 0.2 or 5. When banks change the reserve ratio they hold, they can alter the stock of money in the economy. To keep matters simple, we have thus far assumed that the public holds all of its money as deposits. In reality, the public behavior also affects the money supply through decisions about how much money to hold as bank deposits and how much money to hold as currency. Suppose the Fed has provided M dollars of currency. If public choose to hold C dollar as currency, then the banking sector must be holding M minus C in reserves. The amount of currency plus reserves is often referred to as the monetary base or high-powered money. If banks hold a fraction R of each dollar of deposits as reserves, then there will be 1 over R times M minus C dollars of deposits, and C dollars of currency, so the money supply, which is deposits plus currency, will equal C plus M minus C over R, equals R times C plus M minus C over R, equals M plus R minus 1 times C divided by R. If you experiment with this equation, you will find that the smaller the C is, or the smaller that R is, the larger the money supply will become. In a limited reserve system, a central bank has several other tools it can use to influence the supply of money in the economy. The central bank has the power to set reserve requirements for commercial banks. Banks can, of course, choose to hold reserves beyond this requirement, but manipulation of required reserve is nonetheless a powerful lever. The U.S. FOMC reduced the reserve requirement to 0% in 2020 because the U.S. has transitioned to an ample reserve system. This means that the United States can no longer calculate a money multiplier for lending. Another tool available to a central bank is the discount rate, which is the interest rate that the central bank charges on loans that it makes to banks. Although banks rarely borrow directly from the central bank because such borrowing suggests that they may be in financial difficulty, the discount rate is closely linked to the federal funds rate, which is the rate charged by banks when they lend reserves to other banks. A higher discount rate discourages banks from borrowing reserves. Thus, raising the discount rate helps to reduce the quantity of borrowed reserves and therefore reduce the supply of money. This tool is used in ample reserve systems as well as limited reserve systems. Bank runs. One of the problems that arise in a system based on fractional reserves occurs when the public suddenly decides that it wants to hold substantially more currency than it has been holding. Since banks have reserves equal to only a fraction of their liabilities, then they will not be able to pay all their depositors. If depositors begin to fear that they may not be able to withdraw their deposits, they will hurry to the bank to get their deposits ahead of other depositors. Such a rush of withdrawals is called a bank run. Even if a bank is solvent, meaning that its assets exceed its liabilities, it will not have enough cash on hand to meet all of the demand, and it will be forced to shut its doors until the loans are repaid, or it can borrow additional funds or sell assets. When a solvent bank experiences a spike in demand, it is the Fed's responsibility to act as a lender of last resort to prevent disruption to the banking system. Today, bank runs are very infrequent, but in the past, they were a significant source of financial disruption. Money and inflation in the long run. Earlier, we discussed how economists measure inflation. Figure 40 shows how the cost of living has changed since 1960. The increase in CPI shown in Figure 40 implies that over the last half-century, the cost of fixed basket of consumption goods has increased by a factor of about 8.6. The CPI in 2019 was about 8.6 times larger than it was in 1960. While this is a significant increase in the overall price level over the long term, there has sometimes been periods of large declines in price level. The most significant such decline occurred during the Great Depression, when the price level fell by an amount of 25% in 1929 to 1933. We also saw a small decline in the CPI between 2008 and 2009 as a result of the 2008 financial crisis. What causes the price level to rise or fall over time? To begin with, suppose that the price of a can of soda increases from $1 to $2 over some period of time. What does it mean when people are willing to give up twice as much money in exchange for a can of soda? It would be that they have come to enjoy soda more, but this is probably not the case. It is more likely that their enjoyment of a can of soda has remained the same, but over time, the money they use to buy soda has become less valuable. In other words, inflation is more about changes in the value of money than about the value of goods. When the economy overall prices rises, it takes more money to purchase a fixed basket of goods. Or, looking at the matter differently, we can say that the value of money relative to the goods and services has declined. It may be helpful to state this observation more formally. Suppose P is the price level, measured by the CPI or GDP deflator, then P measures the cost in dollars of a basket of goods. The quantity of goods and services that can be bought with $1 is 1 over P. If P is the price of goods and services measured in money, then 1 over P is the value of money measured in terms of goods and services. In the long run, the value of money is determined in the same way as the value of any other item in the economy, by the interaction of supply and demand. We have just seen how supply and demand depends on the Federal Reserve and the banking system, which the Federal Reserve use a higher interest or reserves to encourage banks to hold more money. The supply of money contracts. When the Federal Reserve decreases the interest rate reserves, the supply of money expands. Because of fractional reserves, the effect of these actions are magnified. But the key point is that through its policy actions, the Federal Reserve can choose the supply of money. The demand for money depends on how much of their wealth people wish to hold as money instead of in the form of other less liquid assets. The chief reason that people choose to hold money rather than other assets is because of the usefulness of money as a medium of exchange. The greater use of digital payments, for example, using Apple Pay on an iPhone, will reduce the need to use money. A desire for contactless payment, whether for conveniences or to avoid possible disease transmission, as was a concern in the early COVID-19 pandemic, may speed up this transition in the coming years. But the most important determinants of how much money people demand are the volume of transactions they engage in and the prices at which these transactions take place. Holding constant of the real level of activity in the economy, we would expect that a doubling of the prices would cause the demand for money to double. How does the economy balance people's demand for money with the level of money that the Fed chooses to supply? The answer depends on the time horizon that we are considering. For the moment, we will focus on the long run, by which we mean a time period over which the price level adjusts to equate the demand for money with the available supply. The injection of more money into the economy thus causes an increase in the demand for goods and services, but the economy's supply of goods and services has not changed. We have seen that the ability of an economy to produce goods and services depends on the available technology and on the quantity of labor, capital, and natural resources available. None of these has been changed by the additional money, so the supply of goods and services should not change. The combination of higher demand and fixed supply will cause the price of goods and services to rise, and thus this increase in price will continue until prices has risen enough to cause the demand for money to once again equal supply. At this point, the value of money has fallen by half, or equivalently, the price level has doubled. In the long run, assuming nothing else changes, the increase in price will be exactly proportional to the changes in supply of money. This result that in the long run, an increase in the supply of money leads to a proportional increase in the price level reflects a long-run neutrality of money. The neutrality of money means that changes in the quantity of money has no effect on the real quantities in the economy. Monetary changes only affect nominal quantities. Real quantities are things that are measured in physical units. For example, a bushel of wheat and a ton of steel are real quantities. Nominal quantities are things that are measured in monetary units. Examples would include the price of a bushel of wheat or GDP in current prices. Notice that the relative prices of different goods and services are real quantities. For example, if a bushel of wheat costs $6 and a ton of steel costs $600, then the cost of steel relative to wheat is $600 divided by ton, all divided by $6 divided by bushel, equals 100 bushels per ton. Since dollars appear in both the top and the bottom terms of the ratio, they cancel out of the equation, and we are left with a ratio of physical quantities. Similarly, if the wage rate is $10 per hour and the price of an iPad is $500, then taking the ratio of the price of an iPad to the hourly wage, we can express the price of an iPad as 50 hours of work. The neutrality of money gives rise to a very useful tool called the quantity equation. As a starting point, let us define the velocity of money as the average number of times a typical dollar bill is used during the year. If Y stands for real GDP and P is the price level, then the nominal GDP equals price level times real GDP, measures the value of goods and services, and hence dollars, that changes hands. To find the velocity of money, V, we divide P times Y by the number of dollars in circulation, M. That is, P times Y divided by M. To see why this makes sense, let's consider a very simple economy that produces only t-shirts. If this economy produces 500 t-shirts and each shirt for $5, then nominal GDP is $2,500. Suppose that the supply of money is 250, then the velocity of this economy is 2,500 divided by 250 equals 10. For $2,500 in spending to occur using only $250 in cash, each dollar must change hands an average of 10 times during the year. Figure 49 graphs the nominal GDP, M2, and the velocity of money that they imply. As you can see in this figure, between 1960 and 2019, the growth of trajectories of nominal GDP and the stock of money have followed a very similar path, with the velocity of money remaining relatively stable. Using the stability of the velocity of money, we can rearrange the quantity equation to obtain the following expression. The velocity of money times the currency in circulation equals the price level times the real GDP. This expression states that velocity of money times the quantity of money will equal to the nominal GDP. So any increase in the supply of money will be reflected on one of three ways: the fall of velocity of money, the increase of real GDP, or an increase in the price level. Why worry about inflation? Inflation is unpopular. During the 1970s, when inflation rates reached double digits, many consumers viewed inflation as the number one economic problem of the country. But neutrality of money suggests that changes in aggregate price level should not matter because they do not affect real quantities. Despite the neutrality of money, inflation does impose real costs on the economy. First, although inflation does not alter relative prices, it does reduce the value of money. In effect, inflation is tax on people who hold money. As prices rise, the value of currency people have in their wallets decline relative to the goods and services they want to purchase. As a result, people will reduce the amount of money they hold. This means that they have to go to a bank or ATM more frequently, which imposes an inconvenience. Inflation also imposes a cost on firms because firms have to adjust the prices of their products more frequently, and this can be a costly process. Second, inflation introduces a distortion into pricing because firms will not adjust their price at the same time. Relative prices will not always accurately reflect the relative costs of production. Recall that these prices play an important role in coordinating economic decisions in market economies. Because of these distortions, the inflation conveyed by market prices becomes less valuable. Third, inflation introduces confusion about the true value of goods and services in the future. Remember that when someone with saving lends it, they are compensated by an interest payment for postponing their use of money until a future date. But if they cannot accurately forecast the rate of inflation, they cannot calculate how much purchasing power they will have in the future. Uncertainty about the rates of inflation adds to the risks that both borrowers and lenders face in credit markets, and this increased risk reduces both the supply of savings and the demand for investment. Because investment is crucial to the economic growth, inflation reduces economic growth. Short-run economic fluctuations. We noted earlier that macroeconomics is concerned with two issues: the long-term growth of the aggregate economy and the short-term fluctuations. In the preceding sections, we have developed a framework for understanding the forces that determine the long-run performances of national economies. This theory provides a useful description of how the economy evolves over long periods of time of several decades or more, but it does not provide much guidance for understanding the shorter-run deviations of market growth from the long-term trends. In Figure 30, we graphed the growth of real GDP in the United States between 1900s and 2019. If you look closely at the figure, you can see that superimposed on the upward trend in the total output are some significant fluctuations. In particular, the drop of output during the Great Depression stands out, as does the rapid growth of production during World War II. The downturn during the 2008 financial crisis is also clearly evident. Although the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, a recession is a period between a peak and a trough in the economy activity, and an expansion is a period between a trough and a peak in economic activity. During a recession, a significant decline in economic activity spreads across the economy and can last from a few months to more than a year. Similarly, during an expansion, economic activity rises substantially, spread across the economy, and usually lasts for several years. In both recession and expansions, brief reversals in economic activity may occur. A recession may include a short period of expansion, followed by further decline, and an expansion may include a short period of contraction, followed by further growth. A depression is a particularly severe or protracted recession. The recurrent alternation of expansions and recessions is commonly referred to as the business cycle. Business cycle has been a characteristic of industrial societies since at least the late 18th century. The table in Figure 50 shows the date and duration of U.S. business cycle. A commonly used rule of thumb is that a period when real GDP declines for 2 consecutive quarters may indicate the beginning of a recession. The determination of the dates on which recessions and expansions begin and end is performed by the NBER, a nonprofit organization of economists that has been a major source of research on the short-term fluctuations in the economy. The NBER consists of a broad array of different economic indicators in fixing the dates listed in Figure 50. Looking at the data from Figure 50, the longest and deepest period of recession is the decline that began in August 1929, which has come to be known as the Great Depression. During this episode, the national real GDP fell by more than 1/4. Since the Second World War, periods of recession has tended to be relatively short, with only 3 stretching longer than 12 months and relatively mild in terms of decline in real GDP. Expansions has trended to be much longer than recessions, with the most lasting more than 2 years. The fact that reflected in the sustained upward trend of real GDP. We will begin our examination of short-run fluctuations by describing their characteristics in greater detail. We will then develop a model that can account for recessions and expansions, and will use this model to consider the role of government economic policy can play in mitigating these negative effects of business cycle fluctuations. Characteristics of short-run fluctuations. Expansions and recessions have effects that are visible throughout the economy and are characterized by systematic patterns of change in a wide array of different macroeconomic variables. 2 of the most important correlates of fluctuation in the economy aggregate growth are unemployment and inflation. In Figure 51 shows the unemployment rate from 1960 through 2019. The recessions are generally characterized by rising unemployment. Typically, businesses are slow to increase hiring in the early phase of an expansion, so declines in unemployment typically lag somewhat behind the onset of the next phase of economic growth. Like unemployment, the rate of inflation is also tied to business cycle. Periods of expansion are often characterized by accelerating inflation, and recessions are typically linked to slowing in the rate of inflation. Figure 52 graphs the date of inflation since 1960. Between 1960 and 1979, there was a generally upward trend in the rate of inflation, which makes the business cycle effect somewhat difficult to see. But if you look closely, you can see that the rate of inflation was declining during recessions. Potential output, the output gap, and natural rate of unemployment. In thinking about the short-run performance of the economy, it is useful to think of actual level of GDP at any time as consisting of 2 parts, the potential output of the economy and the output gap. Potential output is the quantity of goods and services that the economy can produce when using its resources, such as capital and labor, at normal rates. The level of potential output is not fixed, of course, but increases over time as technology improves and the economy accumulates additional resources. In the subsequent discussion, we will use the variable y star to denote the potential output. The output gap consists of differences between the actual output, which we will denote as y, and the potential output. In other words, the output gap equals y minus y star. Figure 53 plots the growth of actual output in the post-war period, along with the trend growth of output between successive business cycle peaks, which approximate the growth of potential output. Relative to the trend growth of output, deviations appear small in this figure, but they nonetheless result in significant economic hardships. When output is below potential output, the economy's productive resources are not being completely utilized. In particular, unemployment rises when the economy is below the potential output. Recall that unemployment is conventionally divided into frictional, structural, and cyclical components. The cyclical component is the part that rises when the economy is in a recession. Economists call this level of unemployment due to frictional and structural causes the natural rate of unemployment in the level of unemployment that would exist when the actual output is equal to the potential output. The natural rate of unemployment varies over time due to changes in the labor market. During the 1970s and 1980s, the entry of many more women into the paid labor force helped raise the natural rate of unemployment, as did the decline of traditional manufacturing industries and the growth of the service sector. More recently, the natural rate of unemployment has fallen. In the early 1960s, Arthur Ocwen was one of President Kennedy's chief economic advisors at the time, noted that there was a relationship between the output gap and the level of cyclical unemployment. Specifically, he observed that every 1% that the unemployment rate differs from the natural rate was associated with 2% deviation in the output gap. In other words, if the cyclical unemployment increases from 1% to 2%, then the output gap will raise from 2% to 4%. This relationship is called the Ocwen's law. Explaining short-run fluctuations in output. What explains the recurrent alternation between periods of expansion and recession in an aggregate economy? Logically, variations in this rate of growth of output over time would be caused either by changes in the growth rate of potential output, or could occur because the actual output falls above or below potential. The rate of growth of output depends on the growth rate of the population, the rate at which the capital stock increases, and the changes in the pace of technological advancements. Over long periods, shifts in these underlying forces do produce important modulations in the pace of economic growth, but most of the short-run variations in the level of economic activity appears to be due to the divergence between the actual and potential output. In the world which prices would adjust immediately to balance supply and demand in all markets, the economy's resources would always be fully employed, and actual output would not deviate from potential output. Accounting for deviations of actual output from potential output requires that we modify the basic microeconomic model of markets to account for the fact that many market prices do not adjust immediately. The most common approach to modifying our model of economic rests on the observation that in many parts of the economy, firms do not constantly adjust the prices in response to fluctuation in market demand. Economists refer to this as sticky price in the short run. During this short-run time period, firms tend to set prices, sell as much or as little as demanded. It is only after a sustained period of imbalance between demand and desired supply that firms adjust prices. Economists refer to this as prices becoming more flexible in the long run. Because in the short run, firms respond to variations in demand by adjusting productions rather than prices, output in the economy is determined by the level of aggregate demand rather than by potential output. Aggregate demand is the total desired spending on final goods and services by everyone in the economy. Recall that when we discussed the equity of GDP and expenditures, we saw that total expenditures has four components. Consumption, C, is spending by households on final goods and services. Investment, I, is spending by firms on new capital goods such as machinery and structures, as well as spending on construction of new houses and apartment buildings. In addition, increases in inventories are also included in investment. Government purchases, G, is spending by government, federal, state, or local, on goods and services. Transfer payments, such as Social Security benefits and unemployment insurance, as well as interest payments on government debt, are not included in this category. Net exports is the difference between the value of goods and services produced by domestically and sold to foreigners and the value of goods and services produced abroad and purchased by domestic residents. Although firms initially respond to variations in demand by adjusting quantities, in the longer run, firms will adjust their prices to move back toward their nominal level of production. When demand is above their desired level, firms will raise prices, causing inflation to accelerate. When demand is below their normal level of production, firms will lower prices, causing inflation to slow. Over the long run, wages and price changes eliminate the gap between actual and potential output and ensure that the economy's resources are once again fully employed. Economists refer to this as the long-run self-adjustment. Because the adjustments can take significant amount of time, however, there may be potential for government policies to help eliminate output gaps more quickly. This explanation for the short-run fluctuation in the level of economic activity was developed by British economist John Maynard Keynes, 1883 to 1946, in his book The General Theory of Employment, Investment, and Money. This theory that Keynes